Hello, and welcome to Beating a Dead Horse. I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And we're here to talk about who lived, who died, and who deserved to die. This week, we're going to be discussing Alien and Aliens. It's a double feature, double trouble movie. We're really going to be looking at comparing and contrasting how Ripley goes from a lone woman on a hunt against an enemy that can't be killed to a horde of humans against an enemy that can be killed and will be killed in droves. Jackson, I know that this is like a childhood darling for you, so let's hear how you felt about it a couple of years later.
Yeah, so as Sean just said, this is, as fucked up as this may sound, just when you think about the words childhood favorite being associated with Alien, of all things, being as it is a horror movie.
A fucked up horror movie, that one.
A very fucked up horror movie at that. But no, this was, the first movie was the first R-rated movie that I ever saw. I was probably 10 years old because my mom was a big fan and she took me to go see, since AVP was PG-13, she took me to go see that. And I thought that was rad and wanted to see all the other movies.
Dude, AVP's great.
It gets a lot of shit, but it does what it needs to do, and it fucking does it. But we're not here to talk about AVP. So, yeah, these movies, these first two in particular, were always favorite of mine. I really loved, Aliens. I'd say for a while, that was probably like my absolute favorite movie, but it's been a few years since I had seen them. Last time I watched them, I was probably a teenager, maybe 15, 16 years old. So this is the first time in a while that I've come to revisit them, and basically, I still loved both of them. These are still great movies, I think, each in their own way, but Alien, upon the rewatch as an adult, definitely the better movie. A near perfect movie, I would say. The only knocks against it are that some of the alien effects haven't aged so well. Some of the suit stuff can look a little wonky, and then I think we don't get quite enough time to breathe at the end. Other than that, I think it's pretty much like a perfect movie.
To knock it on having bad alien effects and whatnot, though, yeah, for context, I saw Alien for the first time probably 3 months ago. I saw Aliens for the first time 3 days ago, and I rewatched Alien. But I don't think it's necessarily fair to knock the alien design. I saw it, and the first time it bursts out of that dude's chest and just skitters away, I was on the floor dying. It is just clearly a puppet, and it's the funniest thing now that we have, fantastic science fiction cinematography and CGI and animatronics and everything that look incredible. But for its time, it was an elevated B movie that did a lot with what it had. And I think, even some of the set design, while there are parts of it that really end up lacking because of that, the first time that you see the alien ship and the whole outside as they're walking through it is so beautifully done. It's slow, it's thought out, it's paced incredibly well. It's lovely, and it looks absolutely incredible, especially when they get inside and they see the first big alien that isn't really named in these movies. We know they're precursors now or something like that.
Prometheus.
But initially, you see them and they are small in comparison, and you reflect on the fact that more than likely was not a trick of editing, but an actual set that they built that makes it just so incredible, and it's beautiful. So it's very easy for me to forgive the few lapses in perfect design. And I would actually argue that the aliens themselves look better in these movies than they do nowadays. Watching the new Alien Homecoming whatever trailer looks the alien in it, just you can tell it's CGI, and I think it takes away from it. I like the goofy rubber suits with clearly men inside them. It works really well.
Yeah, don't misunderstand. When I say that it's like a flaw with the movie, I don't mean a major flaw, because everything you said is absolutely on point. That chestburster scene is, fucking iconic for a reason. Like, it's a great scene. The direction, the art design in this movie, it's all fucking spectacular. Like, the design, like, this is my favorite movie monster of all time. Like, it's a great design. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Just the like, when I say, like, the only flaws in the movie, like, these are my tiniest nitpicks. Like, maybe, like, the 2 seconds of the movie where I'm not, like, glued to my seat. When I say that, like, this is probably, like, honestly, after watching it again, like, maybe, like, top 5 movies for me. Like, it's just that fucking engaging from, like, start to finish. So the fact that, like, those are really my only complaints that I have about it are like, absolutely nothing in, like, the grand scheme of things. Just, like, if we're being, like, completely honest, there, like, were 1 or 2 shots of, and part of this is that I had to ruin, one scene, after watching Red Letter Media's review of Alien Covenant. They made a joke about, the scene, without getting into spoilers, the scene in the air duct. They called it the birthday surprise pose, and I couldn't help but laugh when I saw it again. And you know exactly what shot I'm talking about, don't you?
Absolutely. Oh my god. Oh,
so,
I adore that.
No, it's great. Don't get me wrong, it's amazing. But yeah, so that's sort of my only pretty much my only, like, nitpicks of the movie. Otherwise, I think it's just fucking great from start to finish. Aliens, upon the revisit, I still liked quite a bit, and I appreciated what it was trying to do that was different, and I think there's a lot of good stuff going on in there. But it's very much a James Cameron movie from start to finish for everything that entails, which means that everything that James Cameron is good at, kind of creating memorable, like, full life characters, keeping it moving at a pretty good pace. Everything that he does well as a filmmaker is really on display, and everything, the traps that he tends to fall into are also on display as well. And just visually, it's not as rich of a film as the first one is. So, and, watching them, I watched them both the same day, like, more or less back to back, pretty much. And after seeing the original, like, a lot of that kind of visual flatness in comparison, really stands out a lot more. So, I still love that movie a lot. Still think there's tons of just, like, iconic shit that, like, makes you, like, pump your fists in the air. Lots of great memorable lines, lots of great memorable characters, just not quite the cohesive masterpiece that the first one is.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. As I said, I just saw these both relatively recently, and I remember, well, I watched it with a friend of mine who pretty much promptly fell asleep in the beginning of Alien because she saw it as a slow-moving. It was slow in the beginning, but I think that really works in its favor. Meanwhile, Aliens just is gone off the gate, and this has nothing to do with what I was saying at all. Holy shit. Oh, let's revamp that sentence. Yeah, as I was saying, I just kind of started watching these myself. I saw the first one a couple months ago, this one recently, and it really... It surprised me how well it held up and how much more I liked Alien over Aliens. I thought Aliens had some just incredible lines that really resonated with me, like just some of the line delivery and whatnot was absolutely incredible. There was also some absolutely abysmal line delivery, but that's not really important. But meanwhile, Alien just kind of, it was paced well, it was well thought out, it had slow moments punctuated by really fast moments, and it held it's good. It's good. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. It's good. Aliens is good, but not as good.
Honestly, I think that's a really fair summation, and both these movies are both these movies are like absolute like classics. Have been like picked apart, by like nerd culture, by like had such a huge influence on sci-fi. Like academically, like there's so much like scholarly writing on like both of them about all kinds of different like ways to like look at these simple like horror and horror action movies. So that I think that also is a testament to how well they hold up as films, despite all that going back to them and still being able to enjoy them. But I think of the two, another important thing to maybe keep in mind is that Aliens maybe feels a little less fresh than it did, because I feel of the two, it's been the one that's been picked, its corpse has been picked at more, I think, by kind of sci-fi, because you see pretty much in any like science fiction story that has anything to do with like the military, like I'm thinking like Halo in particular, but even others, just all the way it looks, the way the characters like interact, all this stuff has just been kind of mined, whereas the original Alien, it still feels really fresh just because it's so simple and so itself, and it just executes on its ideas basically perfectly, and there was less room, maybe less flab, to kind of take from it and like reincorporate into other things that have become tropes, kind of the way that a lot of the elements of Aliens has, which maybe I think contributes to it feeling a little less fresh coming back to it all these years later.
Plus, kind of weirdly to its favor, I've always been in favor of getting more information about a world, about understanding more about what's going on and how it happened and everything like that. And Alien doesn't give it to you, really. They don't mention Weyland Yutani in it at all, at least not in the theatrical release. They don't really talk about where the alien came from, how it got there, what's going on with it. It's all very cut and dry, and I feel like the fact that there isn't a whole lot of world building to it, it is a self-contained entity, I think does a lot for... It's harder to pick apart. Like, there's not that... It would all be fan theory as opposed to a definitive, this is what's happening, and here's how we pick it apart. Like, I didn't know pretty much anything about the first one going in because it was all self-contained unto itself. Like, I had more of an idea on what's going on in the second one because I've read things of people picking it apart, on expanding on the universe based on this bit of information. The first one didn't really have that, and I think it really leans in its favor.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you're kind of hitting on is the fact that now we are in, like, what? God, counting, like, maybe 9 of these movies? Like, I just... around there.
I think
Like, we've
6.
seen...
Alien, Aliens, Alien 3, Alien Resurrection, Prometheus, Alien Covenant.
And then the 2 AVP films. So, yeah, like 8. Yeah, so but point being, with the exception of Prometheus, like, we have seen this creature and how it works. Like, we're very familiar. Again, it's become like an iconic like movie monster, so we're very familiar with it at this point. But I think that's a testament to how well the first one still holds up, and that you still feel that tension, you still feel the shock and the horror in that chestburster scene. Like, it just all still works completely, even though the alien itself is getting to the point where it's starting to, or maybe not even starting to, like, Alien Resurrection was in, like, the 90s. Like, it's to the point where it is, like, played out, and you go back to that first one and still feel everything, like, just as fresh, I think is a real testament to just the craft on display here.
And I think a lot of that, and I'm going to start getting into our discussion here, so heads up, we've got a spoiler warning from me, and I think Jackson wants to issue a bit of a trigger warning.
I wanted to issue a trigger warning because we're going to be talking a little bit about sexual assaults, because I think given the history of the franchise, And particularly with the first movie, I think it's kind of impossible to talk about the first Alien, at least, in any sort of depth without bringing up the rape imagery, the metaphor it represents for like trauma, and I don't want anyone to be blindsided by that who maybe isn't as familiar with those, expecting this to be just kind of a conversation about like a monster movie. So if that's something that might be triggering to you, if you talked about in any detail, then here's your warning.
Yeah, and I'm very excited about that because I have, as I said, I'm very new to the series and I'm not familiar with this, so I'm kind of curious to see where that goes and how it's going to come back to our discussion. That being said, though, I would like to kind of talk about how the first movie does a lot more showing than telling, and how death plays into that, and why I think it keeps it fresh as it goes on. Basically, the core piece to my argument here in Alien is that every death in that movie has a point, and every death shows something new about the alien. In Aliens, people die left and right, and they're kind of slaughtered en masse. And it's a very different movie, and it has a reason for that. However, in Alien 1, you know nothing about anything going into it, or theoretically. And so you go through the movie not really sure what's going on. And your first death, kind of, is Kane when he gets the face sucker on him. Or face hugger, I'm sorry. Except he's just in a coma, but you're still expecting him to die, and they kind of keep positioning that way. Like, come down here, we have something weird for you to see. You're always expecting him to be dead. So when he's not, it creates a sense of relief, but also unsurety. So when he actually does die, and you see the first chest burster, and it pops out, you learn much more about the universe in that instance. You suddenly understand what the face hugger was doing, that it wasn't just feeding air to him, it was putting something inside of him for it to burst out. And it shows everything that you need to know about what's going on in that instance. And from there, it keeps building on it. When Brett dies, the quiet dude who just says right, and that's kind of his joke, that's the first time you actually see the alien after it has grown up. Every death has a point. Every death is poignant. I would go as far as to say even the death of the ship, the Nostromo, is poignant. And I know it's kind of silly saying that it's the death of a ship, but when the ship blows up, we learn that the alien can survive in space. It's not just a ship blowing up. It's more information, and that's everything in this movie is drip feeding you information without telling you it. You're seeing it and you're going, oh shit, that's not good. Something bad's happening here, and you're kind of learning it as you go. And I think that works really well and is something that's neat to pick up even 30, 40 years down the road.
Yeah, this movie, just on a screenwriting level, is super tight, and the way that those elements kind of keep coming back, how, as you mentioned kind of in our pre-game conversation, when you mentioned that, like, showing us how the scene where Dallas goes into the vents is kind of showing us how easy it can kind of hide among, like, the ship's machinery, how it kind of, like, blends into, like, the background, and we get a real, like, explicit sense of that kind of confusion of being trapped in an area where you should be able to see it, but you just can't.
I mean, it even shows that it's an intelligent being, that it's working against you.
Yeah, and the way that comes back when at the end when Ripley, like, thinks she's safe on the shuttle, and, like, he looks like a pipe and just, like, comes out and is like, time to fuck you up.
I still jumped at that. I knew it was coming, and it still got me.
Because it lingers on it, and, like, you can see it and you know it, but it does just such a good job of, like, blending into the wall that, yeah, it still gets you. So you're absolutely right in that as far as a horror film goes, this is written masterfully, executed masterfully, and I kind of wanted to add, as far as the information goes, even before the alien itself shows up, uh, we're doing a lot of slower work. I mean, I actually didn't feel like the movie was that slow just because I was so engaged with what was going on. But I think what distinguishes this from a lot of other horror movies and the second one, Aliens, is that just how naturalistic like the dialogue and performances are for the crew, and how they're not the badass like space marines from the second one. They're not like big bold heroes. They're space truckers, and they're just sent to do this job, and like they're bitching about their pay and getting their fair share, and like there's some squabbling between like the mechanics on the ship and like the people who are in command, and like it feels very grounded, very realistic. And it's not like if we're thinking about like other horror movies, like a Jason movie or like a Nightmare on Elm Street film, how like the characters exist to either just be like either blank slates so we can watch Jason like beat someone against a tree in a sleeping bag and like cheer, or we're actively rooting for them to get fucked. Like these characters, part of the sadness is that like these are all like decent, normal people who are in a bad situation. We're getting fucked over by like the man. They're getting it's all been a setup to get this creature back for some corporation that's being represented by just this robot. And I think
that's the other thing. And like just because you mentioned this robot, you don't know he's a robot until he's dead.
Yeah, and until then, and and if you're watching it like the second time, there's a robot, like you're seeing all these signs, but the way it plays, like earlier in the movie, is a lot simpler in that you kind of have this Trinity thing going on, and I think it's sort of interesting how Ripley's the protagonist, but it's kind of ambiguous on that front for like the first half of the movie, just because Dallas is the one in charge, he's the one making decisions, and it's kind of Ripley and Ash like kind of trying to vie for like control over Dallas's decisions. Like they will both try to convince him of a certain way to go, and like he kind of changes his mind. So until then, like Ash is kind of like he's playing the role of our villain, but the fact that he is just like a faceless drone for this like corporation, this robot, this artificial person, isn't really something that's super important. But when it finally comes up, when like we finally see that reveal of like the really like really gross like way he's like taken out, and like his like flappy skin and his like detached head, and we finally see that, it makes sense that like this really calculating like cold person would just be like a stand-in for like the company amongst these otherwise normal people.
And there's some really interesting dialogue too that really points to it. Like the part that really sticks out to me is at one point Ripley looks at him and says something along the lines of like, "Have you and Mother figured your calculations?" And he refers to himself and Mother, the ship's computer, as kind of like a royal we, which initially seems like, oh, he's just talking, he's working with this computer. But like on a second watch through, when he's a robot, you kind of get more of a sense that he's intimately familiar with Mother beyond just I'm a dude who talks to a computer. It's interesting that there's a little dialogue that really hints at it, and once again, you don't have any idea on what's going on and the crew doesn't either, until he's dead, and all of a sudden they're like, "Holy shit, he's a robot." Well, fuck.
Ash is a goddamn robot. Like, fuck, yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's just a testament to how every scene, every character is given kind of the proper space, the proper respect, like feel for them, even though they like never find the body, and like they know, like Dallas is gone, but like they know that like they have to move on, like they can only mourn for him so briefly. Kind of switching gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about how the deaths are kind of handled in Aliens, because I think it's very purposeful, at least for the first part, and then maybe falls a bit more into the tropes with the latter half when our main crew starts to bite it, because a lot of Aliens is doing something very different, and it's a very intentional contrast, I think, from the very naturalistic performances, the very realistic characters of the first one, and that Aliens first half is kind of using James Cameron's penchant for hammy dialogue at its best and most purposeful, I think, in that we get the same setup, but it's not the kind of real problems like these space truckers. It's a bunch of one-liners, a bunch of like really macho, like bro shit from this crew of colonial Marines. And, especially it's most obvious with Hudson, Bill Paxton's character, who acts like just like a total asshole.
God,
and like we see that.
Could not stand him.
Oh, he's such a piece of shit. I love him. Yeah, so we get this real confidence, this real bravado from them, and then the fact that we kind of see all of them and get a little bit from them establishes their role like just enough. Like we don't really care for them the same way that we do for the crew on the first one, because then about maybe a little before halfway through, maybe a little after, when we finally get to see the first scene in that like central core room with all the aliens, it's not like the first one where everyone, it really lingers on them and you get this gut-wrenching feeling. They just get fucked.
Yeah.
They are just like surrounded at all sides by out of nowhere, and like suddenly all that bravado, all that like machismo just goes out the window, and that's why I think it's really fun and really satisfying after seeing like asshole Hudson the whole time, like after everything is just like total chaos in that initial room, to just see him then spouting like the classic like one-liners of him just completely losing his shit and just breaking down like a total bitch, and it's satisfying and interesting in a way, because this is a movie that is clearly operating, at least for those scenes, in the realm of like a war movie, of like, and particularly this is a movie that was really influenced by like Vietnam. You have the big like technologically advanced Marines. They have all this like these pulse rifles, all this firepower that they can't even use in this room, that because the environment is so bad, like all that technology and stuff, it just doesn't help them, and they're playing on the home turf of this like stealthy like smaller force that just like completely overwhelms them, just completely gets the jump on them, and really reflects, I think, sort of how around that time Vietnam today as well, but like it started to be viewed after we kind of had to like suffer through that failure. America kind of suffered through that failure as a country, and that started to be reflected on this movie as not like a horror movie, but as like a war action movie. And that sort of breaks down a little bit in the second half, where then we have kind of our remaining crew of important characters, and it's played a lot more like a zombie movie. Like they're kind of trapped in a room and kind of trying to hold off like the horde, and then they kind of come and get picked off. And I think that intent starts coming in like a lot less clearly. I think there's kind of a divide in general between the first half and second half of these movies, and while I like both halves, I don't think they quite fit together as like a thematic whole.
I mean, barring the theme of it, I think my problem with Aliens comes more from, you ride the high of Alien with this nigh indestructible creature who runs around and, I mean, essentially kills for fun. We see Parker and Lambert both dead, but like they haven't been eaten, they haven't been anything. He's just slaughtering things, with little that they can do about it. In Aliens, we see a lot of them die very quickly, which while kind of cool and cathartic, I feel undermines what the alien is, especially because then it becomes more a matter of aliens are fighting to survive, less just slaughter things because they can. And I really like that whole they're slaughtering because they can. They don't need a motivation. It just feels weaker in the second because of that. Because of how death of both the aliens and the humans are handled, I think it undermines the quote unquote character of the alien.
Yeah, and
Also, holy shit, if I said alien one more time in that sentence, I was not going to be able to know what it means.
yeah. So I think kind of related, going off of what you were saying, is that with that motivation aspect, in that you can really, I think you can kind of define the character pretty succinctly of the alien in both movies. In the first one, it's much more of like an unknowable, like almost like Lovecraftian like presence with all this
Unknowable, unkillable.
Yeah, like you can't like Ripley doesn't shoot it, like she has to get it out of the airlock, like she can only get rid of it. And that also I think plays into kind of the trauma metaphor, and that like you can only like look away from it, you can't like truly escape it. But so yeah, and it has kind of these human but not quite features, and like you said, not really killing for food or anything like that. Incidentally, that's why the theatrical cut of the original movie is better than the director's cut, because the director's cut shows a scene much like out of Aliens where like Brett and Dallas are like cocooned to the wall and like implied to be like used as like a host or something, like so they can be transformed into more aliens.
Oh, really?
At the end. Yep.
Interesting. I'm kind of glad I didn't see that, actually. I like that it just kills because it is a killing machine.
Yeah, so the theatrical cut really emphasizes that. Aliens, for better or worse, you know, depending on how you look at it. And in your case, definitely for worse. Like let's not sugarcoat it. Aliens turns them into bugs. They give him a queen and all that. I love the queen, of the design of the queen, and like the whole role.
So it's a bug hunt,
like
right?
Action.
So
it's a bug hunt. They even say that. And Aliens definitely turns them into bugs, and that I kind of like the horror action in its own way. I like both these movies for different reasons. But it definitely, Alien shifted the perception of how we look at these creatures and how they're treated in the future. And that the lore of the life cycle became a lot more of a prominent thing, even as early as like the AVP movies, and definitely carrying into the really convoluted like backstory that Prometheus and Covenant have been giving.
I feel like I need to go watch those at some point. I just can't bring myself to.
They're interesting movies in their own right. I think if you can get over the fact that like if you thought Aliens ruined the whole feeling of like otherworldly death of, you know, the alien itself, if that's like one of your favorite things about the first movie,
So keep it detached is what you're saying. Like,
yeah, it's
don't let it seep into the reality of Alien and let it be itself.
Yeah, because they, you know, they're explicitly about like trying to answer questions or whatever. Like, you know, we see the space jockey. You know, Prometheus and Covenant are kind of a whole matter of their own. But yeah, I think definitely turns into a bug hunt, and then in the second half of Aliens, the feeling of the overwhelming swarm doesn't really. It feels like the threat kind of just goes away for a little bit as they seal themselves into the room, and then it suddenly just comes back all at once, and then like everyone but Ripley, Newt, and Hicks are killed, just kind of in quick succession, and yeah, and I think there's some satisfying deaths within that. I like Vasquez and the like bitch boy Lieutenant Gorman. I like their little blow themselves up death. It's, very James Cameron-y, very kind of schlocky, but I think it's cool and satisfying on kind of that base level. I like
And
that
they're the two that were
Hudson.
like intimate, weren't they? Or no, they're the two that
No.
reconciled.
Yeah. So I think that worked well as like a character moment. I like
Yeah.
that Hudson just kind of gets dragged into the ground, like screaming, like dies like a dog. Really, I think most of my problems with those deaths are more structural, less than the particulars of it. And I'm a little mixed now that I'm talking about it, just because the force just kind of comes back. I think the problem is less with that scene and more with just kind of the prevailing like quiet scenes that we don't get a great sense for them like being pressured by this overwhelming force. The scenes are maybe too quiet before that, because the only death that occurs in those last moments that I really have a problem with is Burke's. Burke needed to die so much harder than he did. Like we barely even like linger on it, even though he's like the slimy, like classic slimy asshole James Cameron villain. And for a character like that, you really need something grisly. You really need something that sticks out in your mind. Like Hudson got it worse than he did, and he didn't deserve it nearly as much.
See, counterpoint to that though is I kind of like how he died, which was off screen and unimportant. Like it treats him as something that doesn't matter, as something that is insignificant to the human race and shouldn't be. It shouldn't have the respect that you want it to have. Like something that just needs to be killed unceremoniously and thrown to the wind. Everyone else who dies, who even go out gloriously, or brutally, either way, were characters that you've to some extent like. You want to see them live. The only person who you particularly want to see die is Burke, because he's an asshole. Everybody else, I feel you seeing them go out in that blaze of glory or just gruesome getting dismembered, whatever, what have you, works because it feels appropriate for a Marine. It's impressive to see, and it's satisfying for their death. I like that Burke was kind of quietly killed off camera, left to suffer, but not to show us his indignities.
Yeah, I can buy that. I think just for the tone of the scene, it's not like a huge problem for me, but it was something I just sort of noticed. I think it would have gelled well with kind of the tone of the scene, kind of the way Cameron works as a filmmaker, if he was given kind of that classic, like, satisfying bad guy death. Here's a good example. Jurassic Park, the lawyer.
Yeah.
Kind of runs off cowardly, like, gets eaten by the T-Rex in a spectacular fashion. And I think that would have worked really well, just kind of for the general tone and atmosphere that Cameron uses. So I don't disagree with your assessment, though.
Yeah, and I get what you're saying. Like, there is kind of two schools of thought to it, and I don't think that either are necessarily wrong. I think having him be killed in the most over-the-top brutal way would be cathartic for the audience, but I like the quiet, without remorse, without dignity as well.
It definitely moves on, like, at a quick enough pace to really, like, emphasize that we're moving on to more important things. We're moving on to, like, the escape, and then hit and then Ripley, like, suiting up to go fight the big, like, Queen Mother alien and get that, like, big epic, like, kaiju showdown, basically.
I didn't much care for that scene.
See, it's so I thought it was, watching it again, I was wondering how I was going to feel about it, because I thought that scene was just super badass when I was a kid. And I still think that it is, but I think why maybe it doesn't quite land as well as it should, just from a filmmaking perspective, is that I think a piece of Ripley's character arc just maybe doesn't feel like it's there. Because we see her at the beginning, and really emphasizing that trauma metaphor in the first one, that, like, she's having, like, PTSD nightmares, just having all these problems, like, can't get over this experience. And we see her as kind of the traumatized civilian, and we see her as kind of like the mama bear, like, badass, but I don't think we really get a moment where that sinks in, where she kind of moves from one mode to the other. And I think because what made me think about this was how it had moved, and kind of why I think I was still sort of into the scene, just maybe needed a bit more connective tissue, was that her attitude towards the alien had moved from one of fear to one of hatred.
Yeah. That is kind of odd.
Yeah, and I think that could have worked like really well, and I still think it works pretty well for me overall. But like it really emphasizes that, like, you know, there were like two aliens like sneaking up on her in the nest, and there was like the queen who was kind of rooted to her spot. But like she like takes her time to like unload that whole clip, like burn every last egg, and like, you know, really make sure like the queen like watches her children like get all of them like absolutely fucked, and just pumps all of her grenades into it. And it's really deliberate, in a way that I think if it had emphasized kind of this move from like
I think that scene works.
No, I think it does too.
I think it works. See, let me put it this way. I think that scene works as a final fuck you to the aliens. As a, if you want to get into the trauma metaphor, it does a lot to kind of, you know, show her attempt to move past it, to burn her past, to remove it from what she is, from who she is. And I like that because it doesn't exude hate as much as just I want this cleansed, I want this gone. And so when she gets up and fights the alien in a suit, I think my biggest problem with that, I honestly think, is I don't see how you can go hand to hand with an alien. Like, that just feels so weird to me. Like, does that make sense? Because the alien is supposed to be this unstoppable, unkillable thing, as we've seen in the last movie. But the fact that you look at this and go, yeah, you know what I can do? I can come back in a mech and somehow kill it. Just feels weird. Like, it's cool to see, and yeah, the Chekhov's gun pays off because, you know, they introduced it in the first act and everything. But it just is. It doesn't feel like any sane person would come back in a mech suit to take on the xenomorph queen.
So kind of two things. First, regarding why I saw it more, well, I think it had that layer as like hatred, and more than maybe just like a burning away of the past, which it also undoubtedly does, is that the movie was very deliberate on showing the queen's like pained reactions to it, like weirdly humanizes it.
Yeah,
and like she wasn't just doing it like to kind of purge this from her own system. Like, she was doing it as like a fuck you from like one mom to another, because that's sort of the other kind of underlying theme running through this movie, and maybe where it doesn't quite jar with the feeling of like a war movie like before, that Cameron hadn't quite figured out how to like meld those two themes in a way that felt more natural, because that's the ending, like finale of the movie, is where like the whole like motherhood thing really comes into focus, or that kind of weird violent motherhood. And as far as the mech fight, I mean, I'm biased just because like when I was a kid, of course, like when she shows up in the mech and just like, get away from her, you bitch, and like I was like throwing my hands up in the air, like cheering. I'm like, oh, this is fucking sweet.
Yeah.
And obviously, like I can't totally get rid of that bias.
I mean, it seems like most people agree with you on that one pretty much entirely.
Yeah, and I think that's just a lot of it, and that Cameron is just very good at making cool things, and like he's very good, even if it doesn't always have the underlying emotional depth to support it. Just the way the dialogue is written, the way everything is shot, like he's very good at making like an impactful, memorable like action set piece.
So are we thinking like, I feel like there's a really big movie of his that's like really big and pretty, but kind of devoid of a lot of things to it. Like you got a lot of, I don't know. I think it had a little boy with a blue arrow on his head, right?
Pandora: The Last Airbender.
Yeah,
yes.
that's it, exactly.
That famous film.
Yep.
But no, Avatar is pretty much Pete Cameron for the reasons that you described. Very accomplished technical filmmaker. Good at making a story that will carry you through the movie. Good at pacing stuff. Good at like doing the basics of like character motivation. Yeah. Maybe not so good at giving it heft or meaning, and I think that's giving it maybe too little credit in general. I mean, on Avatar, I think that's right on the ball. It's a pretty empty movie. But like, I think another reason this movie stands out to me is kind of weird is that we will see him revisit these same themes again in T2 to maybe better results. It's been a while since I watched T2, but it feels more fully formed. Like Sarah Connor as a character, in my memory at least, feels more fully formed than Ripley does, who I think can't really reconcile. I think the film can't so much reconcile like the trauma survivor from Scott's original with Cameron's vision of like the badass mom action hero, in a way that he can do more purposefully with like Sarah Connor in the first two Terminator movies.
Yeah, I mean those hold over to be actual action movies the entire time, so it doesn't have that initial setup to it.
Yeah, like Alien still gestures at being a horror movie sometimes, and that's, I think, a lot of the weaker stuff that feels like it's maybe reiterating what we already know from the first one. Like, they're dissecting the face hugger, and there's all, like, we see them everywhere, and like we know what happened, and we know that the colonists are fucked already. Like, let's that beginning where they're kind of exploring the colony felt way slower to me on the rewatch than anything in like the first hour that was supposedly really slow in Alien did.
See, I like the reason I think that felt slower to you than the Alien slowness is because the Alien slowness is very deliberate. It was intended to be like 2001 A Space Odyssey-esque, where it was a slow build and everything kind of felt dry and monotonous, and was supposed to, because everything's still building and we're still trying to understand what's going on. And as of right now, nothing's happening. It's just a crash. But in Aliens, we all know what's happening. We're watching an Aliens movie. We know it's a xenomorph. We know it's got facehuggers. We know that everyone on the ground is fucked. It would be a better twist had they not already been dead. Like, at least then it would have built to something different, but we knew what was coming. And had they treated, like, Ash versus Bishop, in the first one, they treat Ash as a regular human the entire time. So when it comes out that he is a synth, we're all like, whoa, where'd that come from? How did that happen? Bishop, they reveal it immediately that he's a synth. So there's not attention to it. Like, we're not spending the entire time going, all right, who's the synth this time? We're going to play that game and we're going to immediately know. Like, it's weird that he acknowledged, that Cameron recognized that was something that needed to be brought up ahead of time so that we don't spend the entire time wondering, but didn't do that with the overarching plot. Like, I feel like that would be the bigger thing to catch.
Well, with Bishop, it's also doing the double work of being a character thing for Ripley, and that, you know, because of this, she doesn't trust him and thinks, and it's kind of setting up that betrayal that ends up not happening. So it's kind of doing that double work. But yeah, with the plot, it feels there's just kind of this inevitability to it that I don't think is really being played in a good way until kind of the and maybe that's kind of the point with the whole war movie setup, that we like, if we're going in with this as like a post-Vietnam movie, like knowing that like we get all this elaborate like gun military porn, and we already know that like it's going to end badly. So maybe that's kind of feeding into that. But the act of just generally watching it and kind of the side business of like finding Newt and like having to introduce her in a way that, you know, doesn't really feel organic at all. I think just bogs down the film a little bit.
See, counterpoint to... So basically, welcome to our Aliens podcast. We are going to argue about whether the landing in Aliens was important or not and how they could have handled that better. Fuck everything else. Because basically, you're going into this, you're still expecting an alien movie. Like,
Yeah.
you still all even if it is supposed to be kind of a loosely a war movie, the whole setup to it, while yes, is a little bit more gun-toting and hoorah than Alien, it still is kind of slow and designed to be a little bit more expository. And here's what's happening. Like, it doesn't dump you into it like a war movie would. So you're still expecting more of a horror movie, even if, like, you made the point that, in the second one it's a bunch of army dudes, and in the first one it was just a bunch of engineers and whatnot, which you're not wrong in that, it shows what a different mood could be. However, they are still just a bunch of dudes, no matter how you look at it. The first movie could have just as easily been done with a bunch of army dudes as opposed to space engineers and pilots, provided that guns weren't as effective. The effect would have been the same. So it feels like it's setting up to be a actual Alien movie than a spiritual successor to Alien, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I do disagree a little with the importance of them being Marines. I think that would change the tone of the first one quite considerably, just because, like, in terms of, like, the horror movie, like, relating and caring about these characters, it makes them feel kind of closer to home since they have kind of these, this kind of blue-collar, like, trucker status. But B, I also think, maybe the other element that Aliens, since we're talking about, like, the military, doesn't play off of quite as much that the first one really does, is coming back around to my trigger warning, kind of the whole rape metaphor. So just on the surface in the first one, like, visually, like, obviously, H.R. Geiger's design is very phallic, in every regard. It's every limb on the alien is, like, long and hard and elongated, and it's constantly, in all of its forms, just dripping all this goop. I've heard it put crudely, you see the chest burster, and it's, like, flesh colored and really long, and it just, like, straight up looks like a dick. There's the whole thing with the face hugger is that it gets into you and, like, puts this thing inside of you that you don't want, and then that thing, again, like, with really phallic, really harsh, violent imagery, like, comes out of you. So visually, I think that
Woof.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's very, like, we're talking about trauma, and we're talking about trauma in, like, the general sense, but, like, the film is very clearly indicating a very specific kind of trauma. And I think it's also very interested, that Aliens is less interested in, but maybe should have been more interested in carrying these themes. It's very interested in kind of emasculating its cast, and not just in the fact that, like, our final girl Ripley is, like, girl. I think it's interested in, like, presenting this, like, threat of rape, because in society, like, that's a threat that, like, women, like, constantly have to fear. Like, that's why you don't go out at night. Like, it's something that's just in the background, like, constant, like, fear of that in their lives. Whereas, like, that's kind of the privilege that men don't have to think about. But I think this movie is very interested in knocking down masculine figures kind of a peg by giving us kind of this imagery of, like, the tough, like, bearded masculine captain, and like, the other two, aside from Ash, the other two male members of the crew are, like, the mechanics, like, very Brett's got, like, his trucker hat, and Parker's got, like, his bandana, and they're very, like, typically associated with, like, masculine imagery. And I think this is why the deaths that struck with me the most on the rewatch were Parker and Lambert in that scene where they kind of die in the same room together, because we get the sense that they are going off, and Lambert has been portrayed as the more, like, classically, like, vulnerable character to this sort of, like, looming threat, and she's a woman, and obviously has to like worry about that threat at all times. And we get the sense like the film is trying to like set us up that she would kind of give this like specter of safety and togetherness. But I think the sexual imagery is so strong, and I think this is why, in particular, Ash's blood, when he, like as a robot, is white. Like that's something we just kind of take for granted now. It's like a trope in fiction because of Alien, like Metal Gear Solid, like cyborgs have white blood. But here it's being used for a very specific purpose because it looks, it looks like jizz basically. And that we see Parker just get like fucking sprayed by it in this really like way that's really shocking to him, really like shakes him in a way that's visually like very emasculating. And I think that that's the real horror of that scene where there's the two of them, is that Parker gets taken out like really quickly. Like he's already on a visual level, on the level of the writing, he's already been emasculated like this, and he just sort of just like gets taken out without like a second thought. But Lambert like gets the really bad, like really lingering long death. We don't even see it. We see the alien kind of like loom over her, looking at more man-like than ever in any of its other like shots that it's in, looking more like a man than a creature. It's like looming over her. We see the tail. She's like sitting there just in total fear, like can't run, can't do anything. Nobody can help her. And we see it, the tail just like slither up her leg, and that's like the last shot that we get. And I think that's what makes the original such an effective movie, is that it's not just the text of, the effective like punch of your typical horror movie where you're kind of these characters are getting killed. It's that subtext, that lingering like threat of rape and sexual assault, and how even the people that we think of as a society are safe from it are not. Like all of the like big tough masculine dudes are just taken down in the end like everyone else. And I think that's one of the things that makes it like such a frightening movie still. And I think that's the other thing that Aliens, aside from the gestures towards Ripley's PTSD at the beginning, is missing almost completely, whereas maybe the continuing metaphor, considering how like macho and masculine would at the beginning was, that explicit threat of like emasculation, I think is something that the film didn't really carry on from the first one, but maybe should have, to emphasize that point a little bit more.
Jesus Christ. That was a lot to take in as someone who was unfamiliar with this idea.
I read a lot of articles about Alien, like I said.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh, all right.
I mean, does that, I don't know, does that sound like completely crazy to you? Does that
No, it makes sense. It's just a lot. It's... Oh boy.
I mean, I didn't provide that trigger warning for nothing.
Yeah, no, I was not expecting that. Let me put it that way. With that being said, let's start to wrap this. Any final words? Anybody else you want to talk about who died, lived, anything?
I have one last little thought about Aliens, and maybe isn't a big thing in the grand scheme of things. That doesn't really make it any worse of a film, but is perhaps indicative of kind of how its craft is maybe a bit sloppier than the original. With the very beginning, the first death we actually see in the movie is Ripley, but it's a dream sequence, and we needed that sequence because to establish. Again, kind of carry that theme of trauma, give her that character arc where she straps up and fights back. But I think what stuck out to me as weird about that scene, just from like a screenwriting level, was how that was also the scene where they introduced Burke and like the information that like Ripley's been asleep for like 60 years or whatever, and then it turns out to be a dream. And And again, this is super nitpicky, but it just strikes me as strange that they would try and get both of those scenes done at the same time, just because the fact that we see Ripley die in that scene and we're shown that it's a dream sequence immediately like calls into question how accurate the information we're getting or how important the information we're getting is, even though we're not supposed to. Like, she really has been asleep for 60 years.
Yeah, wait, hang on. This is actually, I'm going to tie this into my final thought, because this has been something that's been bothering me. Is that is kind of a dream sequence, which does kind of give you an element of almost an unreliable narrator to it, as you were kind of putting.
Yeah.
So the fact that initially Wayland Yutani is kind of incredulous about what happened, and they're like, oh, well, the black box didn't show any evidence of, an alien. It just looks like you blew up the ship and whatnot. And then all of a sudden they just kind of believe her. It's like, I get what they're doing, and like the company knows what's going on and knows that it actually happened as she explains it. But after being already told that we have an unreliable narrator, and then she's in a room with a bunch of people who now suddenly have a reason to believe her, is just, I don't know, like that part just stood out to me as weird, just because it felt like such a sudden flip from, we don't believe you, we think you're full of shit, and we're going to bill you for the cost of the Nostromo, to, oh, no, we got you, you're going to go supervise this mission that may or may not actually have aliens, but we're not really sure.
Yeah, it's just, they didn't justify why Ripley would be on this mission very well. They justified it very well for, like, why she would go. They justified it as, like, her trying to fight back against the trauma, the nightmares. That's coming in super clear. What doesn't make any sense at all is why the company would want her to go in the first place. I guess because they want, their whole goal is they want this thing to come back. They want to bring this thing back. So, like, why send the person
who survived?
Yeah. Who hates them most or would want to most get rid of them? Although I guess, if you consider, no, they do kind of justify it. I'm thinking about it again. They wanted Ripley to go, and this is me kind of extrapolating. But they wanted, assuming that Burke's plan was the plan from the start, to get her impregnated and have her come back in a frozen pod, and then, like, ice all the Marines, like, fuck with their sleeping cells. That would do the double work for the company of getting the alien back and also, like, shutting up the person who might like take whatever things they're doing, like, public, of some, like she's a liability.
Right.
So I think they could have made that connection a little stronger, but it exists. Like, if you twist
it's definitely some extrapolation to get there.
Yeah,
it's not clear cut.
And I think that could be hit a little harder in that reveal where, like, Burke is shown to be, like, a true, like, scumbag the whole time, because I think maybe some ambiguity about, like, why they would want her to go is relevant at the beginning, or maybe not necessarily a totally bad thing, but I think they need to answer that a little bit harder later on, and, like, really make us think, like, oh, okay, that's why they wanted her to come on this mission. Like, they were it was all part of the plan, as opposed to whereas now, where it's just like, wait, like, they have all these Marines, like, they already have a report, so if they do acknowledge the alien, then, like, why are they bringing her along? Like, what does she even bring to the table? But yeah, so it exists, it just requires some finagling.
Yeah, it's there. You just gotta really kind of reach for it.
Yeah. So, other than that, I guess, just as kind of my last words on both these films, that I think they're great films. I think they're both doing interesting things with death in their own way. Both classics. Just maybe one is more untouchable than the other.
Absolutely. I'm not gonna disagree with anything you said. So with that, let's let's wrap up this episode where we kind of only barely touched on death because we had so much else to say about these movies, but who cares? We hope it was interesting anyway. I'm Sean McKinda. You can follow me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. You can also find me streaming on Twitch at Wednesday nights at around 8 o'clock at Helpless_Skippy.
And I am Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at JacksonJKeller. All one word, all no spaces or underscores or anything like that. And that's pretty much where I hang out on the internet.
Yeah, our theme song is Suicide Alternative Take by Lords of the Highway off of the album High Octane Low Expectations. Go check it out. It's a pretty solid album. With that, we're going to wrap this episode up. And remember,
they're dead. All right, can I go now?